Hello everybody, my name is Katrina Walser and I am a knitting teacher and designer based in Sydney in Australia. And welcome to my monthly podcast on the needles. So in the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. So today is the 1st of February, and this is my first podcast episode of the year. So if you're coming in and wondering where the January episode was, don't worry, you didn't miss it. I had a bit of I don't even know what to call it. January was a little hectic, which I will explain a little bit more later, but this is the first video I've made for the year and it's exciting to get back talking to you because I have some stuff to show you. So before we get started, I always forget this, so I figured I'd tell you what I'm wearing. This is Lydia 2.0, which is a pattern by Ivy and Autumn, who is a designer. I don't know where she's from, but I assume she's from the States. And I'm going to stand up quickly because the main interesting thing about this top is at the bottom. So it has this really nice lace detailing down here, which is really nice. And it was a little complicated to begin with, but it turned out really prettily. And I think this was the first time I learned how to do a tubular cast on, which was a nice thing to learn. The yarn is called Cotton Pure and it's from Pearl Soho. So this was actually a top that I made while I was living in America. So it's a couple of years old now, but it's still holding up quite nicely. I am really glad that I have this because it's finally warm enough here in Sydney to wear summer knits. But it's pretty funny because I went to my summer knit cupboard, well, drawer at least, I don't have a whole cupboard, to figure out what to wear for today. And I realized that as much as I love summer knits, I don't actually have many that I've designed, which is something that I'm going to be rectifying in the next couple of months, but I'll share more about that when I can, because some of the patterns are for magazines and things, so I'll talk about them when they come out. I am also wearing these earrings. I figured I'd point them out. These are from 1121, sorry, I always choke on this name, sorry Lisa. These are from 1121 Windmills. She is a friend of mine. I've met her a couple of times now. It's really nice having real life knitting friends. But she lives in a different city that's sort of close-ish to Sydney, but she comes back to Sydney every so often to visit people. And she opened a notion store a little while ago. So she makes notions and really pretty fibers that you can spin into yarn. I know nothing about spinning, so yeah, they're pretty. That's basically all I can say about those. But she made these rainbow stitch markers to start with, and then I just pointed out that they would make really nice earrings, which apparently a lot of people told her. So she changed them into earrings, or at least added an earring option to them, and I got them for Christmas from my sister. So I really love them. I've been wearing them around a lot in the last month since I got them. Oh, I also wanted to say, if you are new here and this is the first episode of the podcast that you're watching, thanks for joining us. Especially if you are a new subscriber since the last video. So in case you missed it, I posted a year-end wrap-up for 2021 at the very, very end of last year. And a lot of you liked it actually. It got a lot more views than I expected and quite a few new subscribers. So hi everyone who's new here. Thanks for joining in. So the first section, as always, is on the needles, which is all the stuff that I have been working on, both whips and FOs. I actually only have one FO to show you. Like I said, January was a bit hectic. So this is something I finished before Christmas, actually. So it's a pretty old finished object now. But I finished my daughter's Christmas stocking. So if you saw the last episode of On the Needles, I went into a lot of detail about these stockings, so I'm definitely not going to talk much about it. but this was the third of the 3 stockings I was trying to finish in time for Christmas. It's got her name on this side and then her nickname on the other side. And yeah, it came out really prettily. I asked her for her opinion on the colours, and she picked out these colours from the big pile of Christmas looking yarn that I had. And then I asked her what colour she wanted the inside to be, and she said light blue, which is pretty funny because it's not a Christmas colour, but it's quite pretty inside. I like this material. So that worked out really well. One thing that was funny with this one is that I decided to try knitting it toe up. So in the pattern, you're meant to knit a tube and then add the toe in at the end. And I couldn't understand why you couldn't just knit it toe up. So I did that, and then I figured out why. It's because knitting the toe is sort of awkward, and I accidentally knitted on in the wrong direction. So this seam that's meant to be running down here, it was here at the front and here at the back. So I had to cut the toe off and then knit it back on at the end anyway. So that's my Christmas stocking. I took a photo of all 3 stockings next to each other, and I'll pop that up on the screen. Don't freak out, that's not a real fire. It's my TV. I had some people worried when I first posted the picture that I was going to set my stockings on fire. It's not a real fire. In terms of whips, that brings me to my first whip. So I finished all of the stockings and then realized that I had neglected my nephew. So my nephew was born around Thanksgiving, and there was no way I was going to finish a stocking and then get it to them in time because he's over in America. So I have been taking my time with this one. I picked out this sort of darker colours because he's a boy and I thought it looked a bit more boyish, and I think they turned out really nicely. So I have finished his name on this side, and then I'm halfway through his name on this side. And once that's done, I'm going to sew the lining in. So the lining's just red. I've already cut it into a vague stocking shape. I just need to measure it properly and cut it down to size and sew it up. And then I'll hand stitch that into the stocking itself and then add the I-cord border around the top, and then we'll be done. So we're hoping that we'll be able to go over and visit them in April or so. So that's the only deadline I've really got for this. So I'm just taking my time with it. I would like to get it done though, because my sewing machine has been sitting out on my desk just waiting for me to finish sewing up the lining. And then it'd be nice to put it away because it takes up quite a bit of space on my desk. Alright, the rest of my whips I'm just going to talk about in whatever order they come out of this basket. And this is my new knitting basket. It's really pretty. It's the second half of my Christmas present from my sister. It's meant to be a pot plant holder. Like you put a pot inside of this. But she said I could use it for whatever I wanted. And so it is now my new whip holder. Alright, so let's see what I've got. Okay, so first off, I am making a Kala Galdana, which is a summer top. It was designed by Heather and Hops, who is another podcaster. Her name's Kat too, which is sort of fun. So I'm going to pop a picture of what it looks like up here. It's a pretty open top and it has like a split in the back. Mostly stockinette, but then at the bottom it has a nice chart with some texture. So I'm in the process of making that, but I can't show it to you right now because it is blocking. So I'm going to explain why I'm blocking midway through a project, with the caveat that this is not something I expect anyone to do. It's mostly me being pedantic, and I can imagine that it's not worth the time or effort for most people. So don't feel like I'm suggesting this. It's just something that I've decided to do because I don't mind doing it and I don't hate blocking. So the way the top works is you knit the front and then the 2 backs separately, and then you join them all, knit flat for a couple of rows, and then you join the whole thing in the round and you do the rest of the body. So what I've decided to do is before I joined in the round, I put all of the stitches on some waste yarn and then I blocked it. And there are a couple of reasons for it. The first one is that blocking stuff in the round annoys me a lot of the time, especially when it's in pieces like this, because I feel like I can't pin it out properly because you can't see one of the halves. So if you imagine this was already joined up in the round, you'd have to fold it in half, and then when you blocked it, you'd pin it down, and you either wouldn't be able to see the back or you wouldn't be able to see the front because it would be between the top layer and the blocking boards. So I don't love that because you can't pin it out properly. Plus, it takes longer to dry when it's, joined up already because there's 2 layers to it instead of 1. And also, I normally measure my swatches before and after blocking because I like to get a sense of how the material changes after blocking, especially in a top like this, because I'm going to want to see, adjust the length essentially. So the top is quite cropped, but I want to make it a little bit longer. And so if you don't know how much your material is going to grow or stretch after you've blocked it, then if you knit it to exactly the length you want and then you block it, it will be longer than you intended. So I forgot to measure my swatch before I blocked. And so what I've done now is I measured it before I blocked it, and then I've measured it again now after I blocked it. And I do have a better sense now of how much it's going to grow. It's only going to be a little bit. But at least now I know how long to knit it before stopping. Because then you can just do the maths to calculate. And also, it's going to help when I actually try it on. So it is a top-down shirt. So this way, when I do try the top on, at least the top part of it will be blocked. So I'll have a better sense of how it fits and stuff. So as I knit it and I do fit checks, because I usually check the fit a couple of times as I knit things, I'll have a better sense of what the top part looks like. So yeah, those are all the reasons that I'm blocking as I go. Again, it's not something that I am encouraging you to do. If you hate the idea, don't worry about it. But that's why I did it. So this top is being knit on yarn by Ash and Eve Designs. It is her Fingering Sport 4-ply base. I think on the website she just calls it Aussie Sock, maybe? I'll have to look it up. It's 80% superwash merino and 20% nylon, and the color is called Lavender Berry. So the yarn suggests that you do it on 3.25 millimeter needles, and the suggested gauge on the yarn did actually match the gauge given in the pattern. But when I tried it on the 3.25 millimeters like it suggested, the gauge was a bit off. So my gauge ended up being, I think, 26 stitches instead of 28. But I tried to go down a needle size and the material was just too dense. So I decided to stick to the 3.25 millimeter needles, and I just did the math to figure out which size I should actually be knitting to adjust for the gauge. And so I am a size 3 in the pattern, but I am knitting a size 2 because it's going to end up a bit bigger than intended in the pattern. So yeah, that's my color Galdana. It is actually dry now. So right after this I'll probably take it off of the blocking mats and start joining it in the round. All right, the next project that comes out of here is, okay. So I don't know if I can count this as a whip. I cast it on 3 or 4 days ago, and then I frogged it all because I did it wrong. But this is going to be my 4-way stock blanket. So if you were here in October or November, I had a lot to say about this blanket, but it's a sample for a pattern that I'm writing. It's an old pattern, but I had a lot of issues with it and I wanted to give it a second shot. And it was also a really good candidate for rewriting into an Australian yarn. So here are my colours. This is Bendigo Wool & Mills 10-ply cotton. And nope, that's not the right order. This is the order that it's going to be in. So the reason that I frogged it is that I have been very, very careful with this pattern. It looks really simple, but there have been a lot of different techniques that I've thrown into it. And one of the techniques is that I sort of made up a new cast on. It's not really new, but I cannot find anyone else who is doing it like this. Essentially, it's Judy's Magic cast on, but with 2 different colours. And so what you end up with is a set of stitches going in one direction in one colour, and a set of provisional stitches that you leave on the needles, and they're in the other colour. That's how you get the diagonal line running across the blanket, because you actually cast on in the middle, and then you do one half going up to a corner point, and the other half going down to the point in the other direction. So you do a provisional cast on so that you can knit in both directions eventually. I'm actually going to publish a tutorial on exactly how to do the cast on. So I think I'll probably try and publish that next week. But keep an eye out if you are interested in what's going on. I'll post a little preview of the cast on Instagram. So I think by the time I publish this video, that should be up on Instagram. So go take a look. Yep, so this is my 4-way stop. I'm excited to get it going because I've been thinking about this pattern for a really long time. Okay, the last 2 projects I have are projects that are hibernating. I'm not actively working on them right now, but I wanted to show them to you anyway. So this one is a baby blanket for my cousin's daughter. It was very experimental. I have talked a lot about it in a previous podcast episode, so I'm not going to talk too much about it now, but I wanted to show it to you because I took it off the needles recently because I needed the needles back. And so I've got a better sense now of what shape it is. So it's a square. The texture is really interesting. And the reason that this is hibernating is because I need some more of the sort of greyish yarn, and that is actually going to be in my 4-way stop. So I need to finish the 4-way stop first because I don't know how much of the grey I'm going to have left over, and then whatever I have left over from that I'm going to use to finish off this blanket. But I will link to the last podcast episode where I talked about this if you're interested in details of what it is. It's just a pattern that I made up. And then the last thing to talk about is my sizzle pop. So it has grown. This is actually what I have been working on the most since we last spoke. So that's why there's so much progress on it. So here it is. I just need to make sure I don't stretch it out so much that it comes off of the waist yarn, because I have some yarn holding the stitches at the moment because I took the needles out. Ta-da! So where is my strawberry? Yeah, so last time I showed this to you, it was that long, where the strawberry is. And now it's grown quite a bit. So yarn details and things, I will pop them up on the screen. I've mentioned them quite a few times before. It is being knit on 4.5mm needles, I think. But again, I will pop all the details up on the screen. I think it grew so quickly because I finally got a hang of the pattern. So I think last time I spoke about this, I'd finally gotten a hang of the actual decreases and increases of how to do them. And then as I worked a couple of more chart repeats, it sort of started making sense how the pattern was working. I think especially because up until this point, there aren't that many pattern repeats, so you can't really tell what's going on. But the wider it gets, the more of these little leaves there are. And so I think that's part of why I got the hang of it finally, is because I could actually see the pattern repeating across the row a little bit more. And also just because I'd been working on it more by that point. So I think it was easy to get the hang of. I have put it down for now. I've decided that it's a little bit too taxing on my brain for the moment, especially after the month that I had. and I just need some stockinette to work on, which is why I picked up the top, and I'm going to pick up the baby blanket because they're mostly stockinette. Yeah, because as much as I've gotten the hang of it, it still takes a decent amount of thinking and concentration as I go, especially along the edges here. This edge is not at all correct. I just sort of YOLO'd the edges, and so every time there's a full repeat, it's fine, but as it's increasing here on the edge and I'm adding more repeats, I wasn't really following the chart, so it's gone pretty wonky, which I don't really mind because I don't think it's super obvious, and especially when you wear it, it won't be very obvious, but it is stressing me out a little bit because I know that the stitch count is really off right now. So I decided to put it down. I am going to finish off some other projects first that are a little less brain intensive, and then I'll probably pick this up again closer to autumn when I can actually wear it. But I will move the strawberry now that I've showed it to you. So it's going to go right here. And now next time I show it to you, hopefully I will have made a bit of progress above the new strawberry spot. Okay, so those were all of my whips and FOs. Only 2 projects I'm really actively working on, if you can count not having cast something on yet as actively working on it. But hopefully I'll get back to the Sizzle Pop and the other baby blanket soon enough. So the next section is called Off the Needles, which is where I give you an update on some stuff that I've been thinking about, sometimes knitting related and sometimes not. Today it's mostly not. So I mentioned that January was a little bit, okay, really honestly, January was a tire fire. It was just not good. Long story short, we all got coronavirus. It was fine health-wise in the end. It's just the isolation that really is not fun. In Australia, well, at least in the state that I'm in New South Wales, if you get coronavirus, you have to isolate for at least a week. But the way it panned out in my family, we ended up isolating for 2 weeks, so that was not fun with a 3-year-old, but we survived. But I've had some also just ongoing other health-relating stuff. It's not anything to do with coronavirus. It's just different stuff. But I don't want to go too much into details right now until it gets resolved. Once I figured out what's going on, I will let you all know, just because I think it's important to talk about health stuff sometimes, especially women's health stuff, because it doesn't get talked about much. But I will talk about that more once we figure out what's actually happening. But yeah, so it's just been a very hectic month, very different to what I thought. I had all these grand plans of starting the year off right and being very productive and stuff, and I've just had to adjust mentally to not being able to do all of that. So if you're in a similar spot, be kind to yourself, just look after your health and stuff. It's more important at the end of the day than your work, probably. But on a more fun note, I have gotten back into reading recently. So I was a really, really avid reader when I was younger. Basically, in the same way that now if I'm sitting down, I'm knitting. When I was little, if I was sitting down, I was probably reading a book. Like my friends would tease me at school because, you know, sometimes in primary school how you have to line up for things? Just like you line up to wait for the teacher to come get you to go to class. Whenever we had to line up and sit down for more than a minute or 2, I was reading something. As an adult, I've just sort of like lost a lot of that, but I've been trying to get back into it recently. And my favorite genre by far has always been fantasy. So I read this trilogy maybe about 6 months ago now. This is called the Winter Night Trilogy. It's by Catherine Arden, and yes, this is in the right order. So these were a recommendation from a friend who actually knows the author. So they were classmates in college, and I'm specifically saying college because they were in the States, but they studied Russian together. And so these books are essentially, it's not really a retelling of Russian folklore, but it's, imagine if like I guess the English equivalent would be if you wrote a story that just involved like Cinderella and Rumpelstiltskin and Hansel and Gretel, but it wasn't actually those stories. It was stories about those characters that like use the themes from their fairy tales. As far as I understand, that's what this is doing, but I know nothing about Russian folklore, so I'm not too sure if that's exactly what's going on. But even if you don't know anything about it, you don't need to know any of the backstory or anything about the characters. They're very self-contained books, and they were really great. I would say the second one's okay. So just like if you are finding yourself dragging with it, then just push through, because the first one and the third one are great. And yeah, I really enjoyed these. So I ended up going down a bit of a spiral on YouTube. Turns out that as much as knitting YouTube is a thing, book YouTube is probably an even bigger thing. And so I got some recommendations. So the things that I'm currently reading, it's a series called the Broken Earth Trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. And it's interesting because it's adult fantasy. I'm used to reading mostly YA fantasy. And it's set in a planet where they have essentially an apocalyptic event once every couple of 100 years. And so their society has to reset. And the thing I appreciate about this one is that I really like modern fantasy, because a lot of it these days seems to be trying to move away from the traditional, oh, they're wizards and they do spells that do anything sort of magic systems, and actually have more specific, like nuanced magic. And so all of the magic in Broken Earth is really interesting because it's very geological. All the people who can do magic can do things with like rocks. It's a bit hard to explain, but I found it really, really interesting. I've read the first 2 books, but then the library shut down because of coronavirus, but it's open again. So I'm excited to read the last book in the trilogy. So hopefully I'll get that done soon. And then if anyone has any recommendations for a good fantasy series I should really read, I am really trying to be intentional about reading again. So please let me know in the comments, because I would appreciate any and all recommendations. All right, the next section we have is something new that I decided to try. So this used to be a section called From the Community, which is where I would showcase some projects, like people's projects from my patterns. And I went back onto Ravelry, and I guess I just hadn't looked for a while, but there's a way in Ravelry where you can scroll through all of the projects being made from patterns from a particular designer, and I usually check pretty often, but I went back and looked today and there were so many that I just hadn't seen. I think I just haven't looked in a couple of months. So thank you so much to anyone who's knitting any of my patterns. But I've decided that I'm going to move from the community back to my actual email newsletter, because it just suits the format a bit better, because I can put links into the projects on Ravelry or Instagram, and I can put in pictures and mention people's names and stuff. So if you are curious to see some of the projects that I'd like to highlight, then you can sign up to my mailing list. I send the newsletter out once a month, and the link is just down below. Oh, and when you sign up, you get a free pattern for a really cute sort of beanie. So what I've decided to replace this with, I'm calling it Knitting Clinic. And I will admit this isn't an original idea. I think I first saw Nitty Natty doing it, but then she stopped doing it. But anyway, basically I miss teaching, because since the lockdowns in the middle of last year happened, none of the classes that I used to run have started back up again. So I figured what I'd do is just take questions from you guys and talk through what I think some of the answers are. So I got quite a few questions actually. I put the post up on Instagram yesterday to ask if people had questions, and I already got quite a few. So I'm going to read these off of my phone, because I'd like to get them verbatim. So excuse me for looking down quite a bit. All right, so the first question we have is from Sky. And Sky asked for help about alternating skeins. So she actually sent in a couple of photos, which I will pop up here. And basically she said, this is the front and back of my attempt at alternating skeins for my Queen of Spades. I wanted to alternate for a couple of rows to avoid a stripe between the two skeins. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so first off, Sky, thank you for writing in because you reminded me that I should be alternating skeins for my Colour Galdana top, which is not something that I had started to do yet. So for a bit of background, if anybody hasn't worked with hand-dyed yarn before, essentially because hand-dyed yarn is hand-dyed, there can be variations even between two skeins of the same colour. So what you want to do is when you are about to move on to a new skein, you want to knit stripes of the two skeins together for, it's up to you how long you want to do it for. And that way they blend in together. So it's a gradual change as opposed to just like a hard change if there is a difference between the two skeins. The other thing that it's helpful for is that there's this thing called colour pooling. So essentially with hand-dyed yarn, especially with variegated or tonal yarn, you can get big sections of colour that's like lighter or darker than other sections, and alternating your skeins is a good way of breaking those sections up. So the way that Sky was trying to do it, she sent me a video, is she was just switching yarns at the beginning of the round, which is actually something that I struggle with too. Actually also for my Queen of Spades. My join, like the beginning of my round, looked basically exactly the same as Sky's did. And the reason that it looks like that is that getting the tension right for when you change the yarn over on each new row can be really tricky. You have to be very, very careful that you are pulling the yarn the same amount when you switch the skeins. So the way that you can avoid it looking like this is by actually changing the way you do it. So there are two alternative ways of alternating skeins, neither of which that I've tried, but I am actually going to try them on my new top. So one of them is called helical knitting, and that is a way of changing colours in a different spot every round. So essentially, instead of getting one place where you're changing colours every single time, which is how you get some tension issues, you actually change the colour or the skein in a different spot in the round. There are a lot of tutorials on how to do this. The best one I've seen is from Brooklyn Tweed, so I will post a link to that down below. The other way of doing it is something that I just saw recently from Edible Thoughts Makes. So if you don't already watch Stephanie, she's a great podcaster. You should go watch her podcasts. But she suggests a way of switching the yarns. It's still in the same spot, so at the beginning of every round. But it's really simple. You just sort of move the yarn backwards and forwards. Again, much easier if you just watch how she describes it. So Sky, I think that's probably the best way of trying to fix that issue. Just change your method up, give either of them a shot, and let me know how you go, because I'm curious. And I'll try them too for my top, and I'll let you guys know what happens next podcast. Okay, the next question was from Jen. Jen said, I wanted to ask if you've had any experience knitting cables with cotton or cotton blend yarns. Will it work? Will the cables stay defined, or should I stick to wool? So the answer is yes. I have actually done a cable project in cotton, only one. But I'll pop a picture up here. This was the Silver Fox bonnet. And so it does work fine. It looks a bit different to how it looks in wool. So I'll try and zoom in or make this picture really big. But if you look specifically at the cables that are like the V-shaped cables, you can see that the stitches are quite stretched. So those V-shaped cables were a 2/1 cross. So it was 2 stitches moving in front of 1 stitch behind. And they do end up looking quite a bit more stretched out than they do in wool, but they still look like cables. So I would suggest doing a swatch, Jen, and seeing if you like the look of it. If it's not your thing, then don't worry about it. But the way you can adjust things a bit if you want to try is maybe go down a needle size, because the problem with cotton is that it stretches a lot and it doesn't spring back in the same way that wool does. So especially if you've got two cables next to each other, the gap between can get sort of stretched out. So if you're not liking the look of it after you swatch, maybe try going down a needle size. And if you still don't like it, then that's up to you. But there's nothing wrong with doing it. It'll just look a little bit different. In a cotton blend, I think you'll be fine, especially if it's like a 50-50 blend. The acrylic or the wool will be bouncy enough that it should make the cable look a little bit more normal. If it's like a cotton and linen blend or something, it may be just as bad as cotton. So you want to do it blended with something that's got a bit more bounce. So yeah, I would say it definitely can work, and I still like the look of this. Just see how you like it. Okay, the next question is from Sarah. So Sarah asked, well, this is a bit of a long one, so I'll probably just paraphrase. But she was asking how to take a pattern that is knit in parts and knit it instead so that it's seamless. So first thing I'll say, specifically because Sarah said that the seaming itself was a pain, is that seams are there for a reason. They help your pattern, your garment, not stretch, essentially, because they give it more structure. And Sarah was specifically asking about a cardigan that's knit with a back and two front panels and then the sleeves. So I would say that first off, maybe the first thing to do would be trying to find a seaming method that you don't hate. So my favorite way of doing seams is with a crochet hook, and I've done a tutorial. So if you want to check that out first, just go take a look. Even if you don't crochet, I intentionally made the video for people who don't know how to crochet. Especially with a cardigan, I worry that depending on the material and stuff and how bulky the wool is, if you take the seams out, over time it will stretch vertically. If you still really want to make it seamless, essentially what you can do is take all the pieces, and anywhere there would be a seam, so in your case, it would be the edge of the front panel that lines up with the edge of the back panel, and then also on the other side. You can remove one stitch from each piece. So remove one stitch from each end of the back panel, and then one stitch from the seam edges of the front panel, because those stitches would have been there mostly as a selvage edge that you could do your mattress stitch into. And then you can just cast on. So cast on the total number of stitches for all three panels, minus 4, because 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches that you've removed. And then adjust from there. And you should be fine. Just have a marker where the seam would have been, because then at least that way you'll know where the edges of those panels should have been. For when you get to wherever you need to split for the armholes, it'll be handy to keep those markers in there just so you know where the panels used to be. So if there's any shaping for the underarms and stuff, then you'll know where that goes. Once that's all done, if you want to do the sleeves in the round as well, if it is just a straight, if it's a drop-shouldered cardigan, just pick up around the underarm, like the armholes, once the whole cardigan is done, and knit a tube. The only thing that you'll have to watch out for is that if you are converting a flat pattern into something that's in the round, then because knitting in the round doesn't have a wrong side, you have to adapt the stitch pattern. So stockinette, for example. In the round, it's all knit stitches, but flat, it's knit across the front and then purl back the other way. So if there is a stitch pattern in the sleeves, then you're going to have to do a bit of work to converting it into like being correct for when it's in the round. Going into the specifics of that is a bit more complicated than I want to do right now. But essentially anything that would be a knit on the wrong side, you want to purl instead. And anything that would be a purl on the wrong side, you want to knit instead. And in terms of stitch counts, also just get rid of one stitch from each edge if you're getting rid of the seam. If there is a sleeve cap on it, I do think you're just going to have to do it flat. Or just knit the tube until the sleeve cap and then switch to knitting flat and just follow the directions for the sleeve cap. You'll just have to turn your work at the beginning of the round. So essentially it's like doing short rows. I hope that helps. It was a bit of a vague explanation, But Sarah, if you still have questions, just DM me on Instagram if you want more specific details for the pattern itself. So the last question I got was from Sue, and she was asking about frogging. She said, I get confused about which way the stitches go on the needles and if I'll miss stitches. Okay, Sue. So there are a couple of strategies you can use to make frogging a little bit easier. So the first thing you can do is put in a lifeline. So what you do is you take your piece, you figure out how far back you want to frog, and you put in what's called a lifeline. So you take some waste yarn and you thread it through every stitch in the row that you want to frog back to. I will put a link to a tutorial into the description box down below. So then once that thread is in, you can happily frog, because when you get back, when you rip all the way back, the waste yarn will catch the last row of stitches, and then you just thread your needle back through each of those stitches that was on the waste yarn. I never do this because I can't be bothered putting the lifelines in. So what I do instead, actually, I'll frog really, I won't care, I'll just frog really quickly without looking until I get to 2 or 3 rows above the point that I actually want to stop at. And then I'll do it a little bit more slowly. And then once I'm on the last row that I actually want to frog, I'll go really, really slowly. I'll take my needle and I'll put it into the next loop that I'm about to unravel, and then I unravel it. And so that way you don't ever have any live stitches of the row that you actually want to catch because they're still in the yarn. So just go 1 stitch really slowly at a time, put your needle in and pull out, put your needle in and pull out, put your needle in and pull out. In terms of which direction you need to put the stitches back on the needles, if you take a look at this loop, it's essentially got 2 sides. It's got a left side and a right side. When you put your needle back into it, you want to make sure that the right leg is at the front and the left leg is at the back. So hopefully you can see that. If you can't, I'll try and put either a picture up on the screen or I'll link to a tutorial or a blog post down below. If you accidentally put your needle in so that the left leg is in the front and the right leg is at the back, that's what's called a twisted stitch. So just make sure that when you pick your stitches back up, it's this way. The right leg is at the front and the left leg is at the back. I will find some sort of tutorial on twisted stitches to help you out, Sue. Okay, so that was all of the questions I got. Thank you so much for sending in such great questions, everybody. So I'm going to try and do this every month. If you do have a question that you want to ask, either pop it down below in the comments or on Instagram on my profile. There's a little highlight that's called Knitting Clinic, and it has a little box where you can type your question into, and hopefully I can get to some more of them next month. Okay, the last section is just coming up next, which is what's happening in the next month or so. So the biggest thing is that I'm gearing up towards re-releasing the 4-way stop blanket, which is sort of funny because, as you can see, it's not even on my needles yet, but I have a lot of tutorials that I want to make for this, so it's pretty exciting. I'm planning on posting a video a week in the lead up to the pattern being released. So thank you so much to everyone who gave me feedback at the end of last year on what sort of videos that you liked. It was inspiring enough that I think I do want to go back to publishing 1 video a week again, at least for the foreseeable future. So keep an eye out. I've got a lot of tutorials that are going to be coming up on the techniques that you need for the blanket. If anyone is interested in test knitting the blanket, I'm going to be sending out a call for testers. Make sure you sign up to my mailing list and I'll send that out in a couple of days. The testing period is going to go from the 12th of February to the 7th of March, so it's 3 weeks, which I think is reasonable. It's a 10-ply blanket, so it knits up pretty quickly. But if it turns out that that doesn't seem reasonable enough, then just let me know and we can see what we can do about it. So yeah, I'm really excited for this blanket. I've been putting so much thought into it and I've done so many little prototypes of it to make sure the shaping is all right. So it's going to be fun releasing it out into the world. So keep an eye out on all of that, and I will be posting lots more about it on Instagram and here on YouTube. The last thing is that February is my birthday month, so it's going to be my birthday in about 2 weeks. It's on the 10th, and I usually do something for it. I'll do some sort of little sale or a giveaway or something. So if you want to see what goes on with that, because I still haven't figured it out yet in my head, make sure you follow me over on Instagram. I am at Oliphant, or sign up to my mailing list because I usually tell the mailing list about it first. So that's all I've got for the month. Thank you once again for listening. And if you have any comments or questions about anything that I've talked about, or if you have a question for Knitting Clinic, make sure you leave a comment. And if you liked this episode, please make sure to hit the like button because that helps other people find the channel. And if you are new here, you can subscribe to the channel by clicking this button right here. And you can watch a playlist of all the previous podcast episodes right here. And until next month, happy knitting!